Okay, hello. Today we are going to talk about Stijl and Bauhaus. First, we'll talk about Stijl. Okay, so it's kind of has a little bit of a continuation of some of the vibes from Suprematism and Constructivism. So if you can think back to that, how those movements, unlike Dada and some of the other movements, kind of had a little bit more of a positive kind of response after World War I. They were kind of upset, of course, by all the destruction and death and horribleness that happened. But rather than shunning the world and saying you don't deserve art, they sort of tried to fix it. They wanted to figure out how a new start could be made after all this devastation. De Stijl is a similar kind of thought process to suprematism and constructivism. So let's see. In 1917, a young group of Dutch artists, this is a Dutch movement, come together to create an optimistic, proactive movement, and they have an accompanying publication of the same name, and that is De Stijl. Excuse me. It is co-founded by Theovan Doesburg and Piet Mondrian. Of the movement, they said, there is an old and a new consciousness of time. The old is connected with the individual. The new is connected with the universal. So coming into this, they really believed that one of the problems that led into World War I was this focus on the individual rather than on community and togetherness and how to prosper and build something together. They believed that art and life should not be separate. They shouldn't be separate domains. De Stijl was meant to be a total integration of art and life. So here's a little more what they say about that. The word art no longer means anything to us. In its place, we demand the construction of our environment in accordance with creative laws based upon a fixed principle. These laws, following those of economics, mathematics, etc., are leading to a new plastic reality. So basically, they thought that because World War I was so devastating and terrible and there was so much chaos and everything after it and so much destruction and so much life lost, that Europe needed a clean slate. And their proposal was that the way to kind of fix this was to start from the arts, but make the arts a principal part of life and kind of design everything with principles and rules so it could be more controlled, and therefore chaos and destruction wouldn't come up again. They were probably Virgos. Okay, so let's look at our friend Piet Mondrian. He's quite a famous artist. You've maybe seen this work or some of his similar works before. He is born in 1872 and he dies in 1944. So in keeping with De Stijl's goal of integration, Mondrian creates a new painting style, and his new painting style is based on basically reducing everything to simple geometric elements. So as you can see here, and if you're familiar with his work, you know that this is kind of what he's known for. His paintings prior to this were quite different. So before World War I, Mondrian studied Cubism in Paris. He was very taken with Cubism. But after coming up with the style, he wanted to purge his art of every overt reference to individual objects. Okay, so he was very into this vein of non-objective artwork, right? He didn't want anything to be a reference to something specific and individual in the world. So he wanted to sever that whole connection with the external world. He went to the Academy of Fine Arts in Amsterdam and studied painting and studied more traditional painting. And as I said, his earlier paintings are much more traditional. And then he gets into Cubism and gets into Fauvism and kind of has a lot of these experimentations. One of the things that fascinates me about Mondrian, I hadn't been much of a fan of him earlier in my life, and he's still not my favorite, to be perfectly honest. But when I was an undergrad, we had this series of convocation speakers. So there were people the college would bring in to give speeches about whatever their specialty was that we could go and listen to, different experts in the field. And they brought in this guy, and I wish I could remember his name. I tried to look it up just now to see if there was some record of it somewhere on my university's database, but it was too long ago and they don't have it on there. And anyway, so this art historian and conservationist who was an expert in Mondrian. I think he had worked with the Tate Modern, but he maybe wasn't employed there at the time. He was maybe also with the Chicago Art Institute. I'll figure it out eventually. Anyway, he comes and does this presentation about Mondrian. And being a art and art history student, I was like, oh, well, that sounds kind of interesting. Maybe I'll go to this free convocation and listen to this guy. So I went, and it was super fascinating. He was one of the earlier people to have the idea of X-raying and doing scans of artwork to see what earlier versions looked like, which was kind of a newer idea at the time. So he showed us all these scans of Mondrian works that he'd been working on for years, and showed us, whoops, dropped in my notebook, and showed us basically how meticulous he was and how precise he was. So this looks like a simple painting, right? It looks like it didn't take him very long. He like taped it off and painted it and he was done. Not the case. He would work on these things for months, sometimes years, and in these scans, this expert was able to show that he would move lines and move squares like a millimeter or a couple of millimeters. He was so obsessive and particular and just striving for this perfect ratio and this perfect kind of realization that he was seeking, that he overworked these over and over and over and over again. And when he would move something, he would go in and take a razor and scrape the paint off down to the canvas to make it smooth, so when he reapplied the paint, it wouldn't mess it up. So basically, this guy, this expert who came and spoke at my college, spent his career looking at this process that Mondrian had, because it wasn't really known that he put that much, that he shifted all these things, and anytime he shifted anything, it was a huge amount of work to change it. So it was really fascinating, and it kind of changed part of my thought process about Mondrian, which is why I'm sharing this story with you, because I thought these paintings were quite simple. And they're supposed to be simple. Like, that was part of the idea, is that they're this pure, simple, purged of all relationship to the actual world. But they're really, really overworked. He really struggled with them and was very meticulous. So that's kind of fascinating to me, something that looks really simple but is actually layers and layers of obsessive work. It seems quite interesting. Okay. Sorry, it's a sidebar, but okay, back to talking about Mondrian. Mondrian, so he is another artist who was fascinated by theosophy. So we've had several artists come up who were interested in this theosophy, right? The first we talked about was Kandinsky. So he wanted to gain knowledge of divine nature through his paintings. He later abandons this in favor of what he called pure plastic art. He wanted to express a universal reality, basically, in his work. That was the goal. So he starts in this place of mysticism and theosophy, and investigating cubism and fauvism, and trying to find things through all these sort of popular veins at the time for artists working in the avant-garde. And then he goes his own path and develops this idea of pure plastic art. Okay. He believed that the problem with Cubism was that Cubism did not accept the logical consequences of its own discoveries. So he thought that had the Cubists followed through their thought process as he did and their exploration, that they would have ended up in the same place that he did. So he felt like they were kind of stilted and stumped their own development, which is sort of interesting. He also thought that reality worked in opposition to the spiritual, and that's one of the reasons it should be avoided. He called his ideas about painting neoplasticism. So this is kind of his theory of painting within de Stijl. Basically, he believed that art should strive to express universal beauty and also aesthetic expression of oneself, which seem like kind of opposing ideas. And he acknowledges this and talks about how you have to work towards these two goals simultaneously and how that's a challenge. And that's kind of the challenge in painting. To reach this goal, Mondrian limited himself to 3 values: white, black, and a perfectly balanced gray, which he almost never used the gray. He was worried about using the gray in and of itself. And then he also reduced his palette of colors to only the primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. He also reduces the directions of lines in his work to only vertical and horizontal, no diagonals. So basically he thought since primary colors were the purest colors, they were the most likely to satisfy this idea of universal beauty because they're pure. And in his compositions, he wanted to maintain what he called dynamic equilibrium. So his thought was that the only thing you needed to create something that was dynamic but still fit in his pure idea about what a painting should be and how it should be composed was by controlling the amount, the ratio of each color to each other and the ratio of black and white. And that's how he thought that he could maintain this interesting dynamic equilibrium. That is Mondrian. Constantin Brancusi is probably my favorite sculptor of the 20th century. He's pretty phenomenal, and I have a real soft spot for him. He was born in 1876, and he dies in 1957. He's Romanian. That might be part of why I have a soft spot for him. I have a Romanian heritage. I don't know. I just really like him. I think he's kind of wonderful. So let me tell you a little bit about him, and maybe you'll be a fan too. So he's born in this little village called Hobita. Hobita is in Gorj, Gorj, which is near the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. His parents are peasants. By the age, he's only like, I think 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old, and they train him to be a sheep shepherd, so he has to go out in the fields and work when he's a little kid, like 7 years old, shepherding the sheep. By the time he's like 10, he is trained to be a domestic servant in someone's house. At 18, when he's working as a domestic servant, he creates just out of scrap materials that he finds around. He builds by hand a violin. And I think it was his employer, I think it was his boss, but it was maybe someone who was visiting who was like a rich industrialist type, sees this and asks him where he got this violin. And he says, oh, I made it, I carved it. I'm from he's from this area around the Carpathian Mountains where there's a kind of, it's where like there's a tradition of folk art there that is heavily based around intricate carving. So he kind of grew up around this a little bit. And so this wealthy person is so impressed by his skills, because this is this totally uneducated kid, that he enrolls him in the Craiova School of Arts and Crafts. So he kind of has a patron, basically, who says, well, I think that you need to go to school. You're very gifted and talented. So he studies woodworking. He graduates with honors in 1898, and then he goes to the Bucharest School of Fine Arts, and it goes on a scholarship, and he studies sculpture. So he learns about metalwork and stone carving and different aspects of sculpture. I don't know why I've had this persistent cough lately. In 1903, he moves to Munich, and then later in that year, he ends up moving to Paris. When he gets to Paris, he works with, he gets an apprenticeship with a sculptor, and I can't remember what the sculptor's name is at the moment, but after that apprenticeship, the sculptor is so impressed with him that he introduces him to Rodin, Auguste Rodin, who we've talked about, right? And so Rodin is a very famous master sculptor of the time. Everyone's sort of in awe of him, and so Brancusi is taken to him, and Rodin is quite impressed with him. And so he takes him on to work for him, to work in his workshop, in his studio. And this is like a huge honor. It's a big deal. This unknown Romanian kid comes in, and Rodin, the master, has taken him into his studio. And he only stays for 2 months, and then he leaves. And he leaves because, let's see, I have the quote written down here somewhere. He says, nothing can grow under such big trees. So he thought working with Rodin would smother his own growth as an artist, which is a pretty bold thing to think when you're just starting out and you're unknown and you don't have any resources, and you get this chance to work with this master, and you're like, I don't think this is a good idea for me. So he's just so plucky. I love it. So he goes off on his own. And in 1913, his work is accepted to the Salon Indépendant, so the independent salon that a lot of our avant-garde artists have had their work accepted to, and it's sort of their first big exposure. It works for him. People are super intrigued and impressed by his work, and he is invited to have work in the Armory show in the United States, which we are going to talk about eventually. I know I keep saying that, but we're going to talk about it in more detail soon. But basically, that's a huge deal. It's a really big deal, and it kind of makes his career. Okay, so let's talk about his style and what he's doing. So he develops his own style when he leaves Rodin, and this is the style that becomes revolutionary and super important to the history of modern sculpture and modern art. Okay, so he wanted to move beyond the surface appearances to capture the essence of the objects. So in his words, let's just go directly to him. Simplicity is not an objective in art, but one achieves simplicity despite oneself by entering into the real sense of things. What is real is not the external form, but the essence. Starting from this truth, it is impossible for anyone to express anything essentially real by imitating the exterior surfaces. Okay, so he's really interested in getting to the heart and the core and the meaning of form and the meaning of his creations. And he doesn't think that the surface, which historically is the most important part of sculpture, right? He doesn't think that that is where the attention should be paid, basically. So with that in mind, we can also see why working with Rodin was such a bad match. If you think back to when I was talking to you about Rodin, remember he was very taken with the Impressionist idea about how a study of light can affect perception, and so he made he paid attention to his surfaces in such a way that the way they were kind of dipped and hollowed and curved and shaped was designed so that the light would catch in particular ways on the surface and give you that emotional kind of reaction to the way you were perceiving the sculpture. So Rodin is very focused on the surface. So they're kind of opposites, basically. Okay, so the curves of his sculptures, of Brancusi's sculptures, refer directly or indirectly to the cycle of life. He's very interested in this idea about the life cycle and about the cyclical nature of the essence within living things. And so you see most of his work is curvilinear, and that's kind of a reference to that life cycle in an abstracted way. Here, this work is called Bird in Space. He does several of these. There's several versions of this work in different media. So this is called Bird in Space, but we see it does not mimic a real bird, right? The form was developed through a long process. So to create this, he started with a sketch of a bird, at rest with its wings rested against its sides, and he looked at kind of just the shape of the bird. And from that, he kept working with the shape and trying to kind of derive it down and down and down to its essential form, which is where he came up with this shape. The highly polished surface doesn't allow your eye to fixate on one particular point. It doesn't allow your eye to linger on the surface so much. basically with the highly shiny surface, your eyes naturally follow the gleaming reflection upward. So it tends to make your eye go in a vertical upward direction. And that gives a kind of sense of movement to this piece. And it gives off a feeling kind of a flight, of moving upward. So from Brancusi, he says, "All my life I have sought the essence of flight. Don't look for mysteries. I give you pure joy. Look at the sculptures until you actually see them." So I think he's quite phenomenal, and to be creating something like this at a time when no one is doing anything remotely like this. I mean, he was a true original, and really was one of the founders of abstraction in sculpture, in my opinion, and was doing things that just nobody even thought to do. He also, a lot of the work he does and some of the things he writes, he talks about how the base, the plinth that the sculpture is displayed on, is as important as the sculpture. And so he paid very careful attention to how he carved and how he created the base that the sculptures sat on, which was also a very new idea. Okay, let's talk about somebody else. This is Barbara Hepworth. She is born in 1903. She dies in 1975. So she's another sculptor who developed her own kind of essence-based sculptural forms. She's British. So a couple of the artists that I'm talking to here kind of fit under the style in terms of its influence and how they work, but they weren't Dutch and weren't directly working with Mondrian, say, but they were influenced by this pervasive kind of attitude that came from de Stijl. Okay, so she's born in Yorkshire in England. She goes to Leeds School of Art in 1920 on a scholarship. There she meets her lifelong friend and rival, Henry Moore, who we're going to talk about next. They had sort of a Matisse-Picasso type relationship where they knew each other forever and they were friends, but they were also rivals. And they influenced each other's work. It was sort of one-directional in my opinion. I think that he kind of ripped her off. But anyway, okay, she then wins a scholarship to attend the Royal Academy of Art in London, and she graduates from there in 1924. She traveled to Florence on a postgrad travel scholarship, and there she goes to Rome. She's the runner-up for the Prix de Rome, which is it's actually a French award, but the winner, it's extremely prestigious, and the winner of this art prize basically is funded to stay in Rome for a period of years, for like 3 to 5 some odd years. They are funded and allowed to stay and make work. So it's a very competitive, sought-after prize. Being the runner-up is a big deal. Being the runner-up when you're a woman is a really big deal, especially in the 1920s. This was like 1924, so it was a big deal. So she is the runner-up for that, and the person who wins that year is another sculptor, and his name is John Skeeping, and she ends up marrying him. So they are both kind of groundbreaking sculptors at the time. They get married in 1925. While in Italy, they stay in Italy for a while because he has this funding. She learns to carve marble, which is a new kind of training for her that's important to her career path. They eventually return to London, and she's the first artist to create these kind of pierced figures. So we have like the figure of the sculpture, and then it's pierced. It has a void, a hole where you can see through it. That doesn't sound like a big deal. That's a big deal. So she's the first artist to do this, and it becomes kind of a hallmark of a lot of modernist sculpture. Hers particularly, it's a big characteristic of hers. It's also a huge characteristic of Henry Moore, who did not invent that. She did. Okay, so in 1933, she co-founds a movement called Unit 1. And Unit 1, the goal was basically to unite surrealism, surrealists, and abstraction in British art. So she was also very interested in surrealism. And in biomorphism and how that could relate to sculpture, basically. Her use of the void, or the hole, in her work is a major contribution to the history of sculpture. From her, let's get from her own words, she says, "The forms which have had a special meaning for me since childhood have been standing form, which is the translation of my feeling towards the human being standing in landscape, the two forms, which is the tender relationship of one living thing beside another, and the closed form, such as the oval, spherical, or pierced form, sometimes incorporating gesture in the landscape." So in her work, despite its abstraction and her quest for finding the essential, the essence, the spirit within each thing that she creates, she still has a strong relationship with nature. She's very interested in landscape. She's very interested in nature. She's very interested in how people interact with landscape and nature when they're out in it, and how it affects their senses and perceptions. So the voids in her work, though they're just the negative space, are as important as the structural mass, and that's the big breakthrough for which she is responsible. Okay, Henry Moore. Henry Moore is also British. He's born in 1898. He dies in 1986. Moore's works are also very abstract, but they generally are recognizable as abstracted representational forms. This one that I selected to show you is just one of my favorite Henry Moore pieces. A lot of his works are figure-based, and they're much more recognizable than this one. This doesn't necessarily look like sheep to us, right? But his pieces that are based on the human figure, even though they're quite abstract, are still recognizable as a human figure. So that's a big difference between him and Hepworth, is that his works, though extremely abstract, are still recognizable as representational works. They're not totally non-objective. Okay. So this picture is for this piece of his is from the Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. If you've not been, excuse me, ugh, I have really bad allergies and I just get all snarfled. Anyway, I know that we're in a pandemic, but when traveling and things are okay again, if you're ever in Kansas City and you go to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, they have a really fantastic sculpture garden. I've been many, many, many times. It's one of my favorite places. I used to go with my grandmother when I was a little girl all the time. Anyway, they have a ton of Henry Moore sculptures. They have one of the best collections of Henry Moore sculptures in the world. So when I think Henry Moore, I always think of the Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. And it's a great experience. It's a great place to visit. Okay, so Moore is very famous. He's probably more famous than Hepworth. In America, he's probably more famous than Brancusi, but I don't know, like, in Europe, maybe not so much. But his main contribution, other than successfully ripping off and translating all of Hepworth's ideas, his main contribution to the history of sculpture is probably his understanding of materials. He used many different materials and always showed the unique beauty of each form, of each material that he's using. So when we come into the avant-garde and into the 20th century, we see that an awareness of materiality and of the material that the work is being made with becomes increasingly important to artists and critics alike. And Henry Moore is someone who masters that pretty quickly. So he has work that's done in bronze, like this piece. He has work done in marble and granite. He uses different kinds of wood. And each work is always done in a way that really showcases the material, which is important and is an interesting thing. A lot of sculptors up to this point kind of tend to pick their medium and stick with it. Excuse me. And Moore is not one of those. He works in a variety of media throughout his career, which is very successful. He's an extremely successful sculptor. Okay, let's talk about what Stijl did. Stijl, excuse me, did in terms of influence in architecture. This is Gerard Reitfeld. He's born in 1888 and he lives until 1964. He really translated the ideas of Stijl into architecture. In his words, the new architecture is anti-cubic. i.e. it does not strive to contain the different functional space cells in a single closed cube, but it throws the functional space out from the center of the cube so that height, width, and depth plus time become a completely new plastic expression in open spaces. So what does that mean? Let's think about that for a minute. So what he's saying basically is that historically houses and dwelling spaces kind of are, a rectangle and we fit everything within that. He's not so into that. He thinks that the exterior form of the space should reflect what's inside. That's what he means by plastic. Plastic meaning it can be shaped, it can be formed. So the form kind of follows the function of the piece. And he's one of the first guys in architecture to do this, to implement this idea in his work. He's also one of the early architects to adopt the idea of an open concept plan, right? So inside, in the interiors of this house, this is one of his most famous pieces, Schroeder House, everything is based on an open concept. So there's the kitchen, there's the living space, there's a dining space, and it's all open, but he put in these movable walls that slide back and forth so that you can divide the space different ways for it to serve different functions. And that's a really new idea. And he's one of the early people to think about that and to use an open concept with kind of implemented dividers as a adaptable space to serve different kinds of function, particularly in domestic forms. I also think that it's interesting to look at this because it kind of looks like it could be a architectural interpretation of a Mondrian painting a little bit. Like when you look at it, doesn't it look a little like a Mondrian in my mind? Like they kind of fit together. Okay, let's talk about Bauhaus. Okay, so Bauhaus is started in 1919, and on both of these my notes have a little bit further information and kind of go through the history a little more precisely. Bauhaus is started in 1919 by Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius also designed this iteration of the Bauhaus, as you can see in the caption there. So it's a school. Its first function is that it's a school. And in it, Gropius, who was the director of the school, wanted to train students to anticipate the artistic, design, and architectural needs of the modern world. So here's that phrase again, the modern world. And like the other artists of the 20th century that have used this phrase, he is talking about the way the world seems to be developing in terms of technology and industry and mechanical advancements and things like this. So he writes the Bauhaus Manifesto, naturally, because that's the other thing we've seen in the 20th century is everybody's got a manifesto. But in his manifesto, it lays out the curriculum and like what kinds of courses they're going to have, and then the objectives of the school. They had an array of classes beyond just your normal like painting, sculpture, and architectural classes. They had those, but they also had furniture design, they had weaving, they had stained glass, they had pottery, they had bookbinding, they had one about advertising. So they had like woodworking. So they have your basic kind of fine arts things, but they also have all these things that we that later kind of become designated as craft, right? So that's one of the main things that he did was he didn't see a distinction between art and craft. He thought an artist and a craftsperson were the same, and that there was no reason to have a division between those two things. In each class, you had a instructor who was the instructor of form, and then you had an instructor who was like the technical instructor. So you kind of had an artist and a craftsperson co-teaching all of these classes, which is a pretty interesting approach. I went to a graduate school that's kind of was originally based on this kind of idea. It's kind of shifting much back towards fine arts in the last 20 years, but California College of the Arts, which used to be California College of Arts and Craft, which was founded by people who had very similar ideas to this. Anyway, okay. The school moves to Dessau in 1924. and this is the main campus building when it makes that move. Bauhaus advocated a marriage between art and industry and a synthesis of design and production. So they also thought that the industrial and commercial side of things should not be treated as a separate thing from the conceptual, the design, and the making of it. They thought that all of that should be integrated. What happens to Bauhaus? Well, one of Adolf Hitler's first acts was to close the Bauhaus in 1933 because he hates artists, because he was rejected from art school. I mean, that's one reason. There are many other reasons. But basically, he thought that the students, because one of the things they had was bookbinding, they also had several printing presses, and he thought that the students, who he saw as radicalized, were creating, printing, and distributing anti-Nazi brochures. And the reason he thought this is because that is what they were doing, because they were very anti-fascist and anti-Nazi. So his response to this is to close the whole thing down. So in 1933, the Bauhaus School is no more. Although it was only around a short time, it's only around like 14 or 15 years, and fewer than 500 students graduated from it. The Bauhaus had a huge impact. When the instructors fled the Nazis, they moved all over the place, all over the world, and took with them the Bauhaus philosophy. So, for example, Gropius, who was the original director of the school and who designed this building, and Breuer, who we'll talk about in a minute, he taught furniture design, they both end up at Harvard University in the United States. And so, in their teaching there, they spread a lot of these ideas to the United States about their design and aesthetic. So it becomes a very important movement, and it has a long-lasting impact. Okay, this is Gunta Stijl. She's born in 1897 and dies in 1983. She was, so the way the disciplines were set up, each regiment of classes had a director, basically. So it's kind of like in a college. You have a chair of a department, and then within the department you have program directors. So like in an English department, you have the chair of the department, then you have like the director of composition, the director of technical writing, the director of creative writing, that kind of thing. So it's kind of like that, but instead of directors, they called them masters at this school, which makes sense because you get your master's degree in art, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so she was the only female master at the Bauhaus, so sort of like being a chair or a program director in our version of college, right? Okay. So that's a big deal. She's the only woman who's in charge of an area. She joined the Bauhaus as a student in 1920. She becomes a junior. No, she joined in 1920, and in 1927, she becomes a junior master and then a full master in 1928. And then she was already teaching there before she became a full master. So when the school relocated to Dessau, she became the weaving director and helped transition the textile program from pictorial weaving to a more industrial textile design. Under her leadership, they acquired the most varied loom systems available. So they had everything from what's called a jacquard loom, which is very advanced. It's a loom that you could mechanically program to a pattern. So you draw out the pattern on draft paper, and then you could program the loom so that you could create the pattern that you drafted. The jacquard looms today are the ones that are connected to software, and you can plan everything out in a computer program, and then the loom will weave for you whatever it is that you have designed. So a lot of that legacy is from the Bauhaus, and particularly from Stijl. So they had that, and they had all the way down to like a carpet knotting frame, which is like a very simple frame loom. So they had a bunch of different kinds of levels of intricacy available in the loom tools. She also, when they were designing the new building, had put in the textile area a facility for dyeing so that they could dye their own yarn and fibers so that they could also understand that process and how to dye whatever colors they want. So she expanded the program to cover more skill sets and different kinds of equipment and the most technologically advanced equipment at the time. So she really took it from like simple weaving to here's all these different levels of things that you can do. So there's things that you could do for like personal decorative type weaving, all the way up to things that would be like produced in industry, like mass industrial produced textiles. So she really changed the program basically in a pretty impactful way that also impacted how weaving was taught for years to come. Okay, so this is one of her works. This is a very complicated tapestry. It's just called the Slit Tapestry, red-green, and it's woven cotton, silk, and linen. But basically, she changes the way we think of textile in terms of how it looks and how it's produced. So she's quite important. Okay, this is Marcel Breuer. He's born in 1902. He dies in 1981. He's born in Hungary. He designed the Wasili chair and the Seska chair. This is the Wasili chair. While he was at the Bauhaus, which are considered two of the top most important chairs in the 20th century. Two of the top 10 most important chairs in the 20th century. So you've maybe seen this chair. It's kind of a famous chair. It's up there with like the Eames chair in terms of recognizable artistically designed chairs. I have sat in one of these things. I do not find them very comfortable, but it's interesting. It's very different looking. He was also an architect. He gets very involved later in the brutalist architecture movement, which is architecture that predominantly uses concrete and is also kind of in line with these minimalist ideas of design that makes sense with his background at Bauhaus. The Wasili chair was originally known as the Model B3 chair. That's what he named it, the Model B3 chair. But our friend Wasili Kandinsky was teaching at the Bauhaus as well. He taught painting there. They were friends. Kandinsky saw this chair, the Model B3, when it was first made and was a huge admirer of it. He kind of gushed over it. And Breuer was so touched that he made a duplicate of it. He made a second one and surprised Kandinsky by putting it in his personal like chamber, like his room where he lived. And so Kandinsky was really delighted by this. And so much later, when the Italian, it's an Italian furniture manufacturer that comes out with these and mass produces them quite a bit later, and they are called Gavina. So when Gavina, the Italian furniture manufacturer, comes out with these, instead of calling it the Model B3, they had heard this kind of charming anecdote, the story about Kandinsky and Breuer and their friendship and him surprising him with his own version of this chair. So they thought it would be a nicer name to call it the Wasili after Wasili Kandinsky. So that is where it gets its name, but Breuer did not name it that. Okay, so that is this famous chair. Okay, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe is born in 1886 and he dies in 1969. He's an architect. He's who took over directing the Bauhaus after Gropius left. So Gropius leaves before it's disassembled by Hitler. He leaves in 1928 to pursue his own kind of work, like directing a college. Founding and it would be very stressful. So he leaves, and Mies van der Rohe takes over directing it. And his motto, which is a famous phrase, his motto is less is more. That's his life motto. It's his design motto. And he called his architecture and the way he saw good architecture as skin and bones design. So he really believed also in reducing things down to their essential components, which is a big theme for both of the movements that we've looked at today, right? This idea of simplifying and reducing down, except for the textile art, which got more complicated. But everything else is kind of about reducing down. So unfortunately, this glass model doesn't actually survive. This is a photograph of a glass model that he made in 1922. So he made this model, and this was his idea for a glass skyscraper, which doesn't sound that crazy to us because most skyscrapers are glass and steel. This was a new idea at the time, and something that has these kind of curvilinear sort of aspects to it, and the way it's designed, so it's almost like bundled. We have like kind of these two columns in the center and then a bundling outward, this simple kind of straightforward design that still has this sort of fluidity, and utilizing glass as one of the main structural components. So it's quite a new idea. And this model is shown at the first Bauhaus exhibition, which is in 1923. So he creates this before he takes over as the leader of the Bauhaus. We can definitely see the legacy of this design in glass and steel skyscrapers that we have today, right? Okay, so from that, the simple geometric aesthetic developed by Gropius and Mies van der Rohe becomes known in architecture as international style. So that kind of design aesthetic that we see come out of the Bauhaus in terms of architectural design gets its own name. It's called international design. The most famous example of international design is the Villa Savoy, which is what we are looking at here. And the first and probably the most famous architect to work in the international style was Swiss architect Charles Edward Jeanneret, who adopted his maternal grandfather's name, which was Le Corbusier. So we have Le Corbusier. He lives from 1887 to 1965. He studies architecture in both Paris and Berlin. He's also an established painter. He's in with the Cubists for a while, pretty early on. But he's mostly remembered and has had the greatest impact as an architect and also as a design theorist. He also wrote a lot about his theories of design. He believed a house should be a machine for living, and he advocated for functional living space. He didn't like the idea of any space that didn't have a direct function. So this builds off of what we were looking at earlier, and this idea of the plasticity of the house instead of it just being a like arbitrary cube that has X number of rooms because that's what fits in it. He really thought that the form was there only in support of the function, okay? And so the idea was that this should be very functional for the people who lived in it. This is his most famous building, Villa Savoy. Le Corbusier believed the most basic physical and psychological needs of humans were sun, space, vegetation, and controlled temperature, which to me makes me think that he thought humans were kind of like houseplants, but I guess I get it, nice sentiment. So in all of his designs, you see a few things that are kind of universal. Other than that it's extremely functional and pragmatic in terms of that design, there's always lots of windows. So anywhere you are in the house, you can see the outdoors. You can see the vegetation, which he considered one of the important things that humans need. And you also have the sunlight coming in, which, since he views humans as basically houseplants, that's very important, sunlight coming in. The other thing you have in Le Corbusier buildings is an integration of the interior and exterior spaces. So if you look at the plan here, you can see that there's this courtyard up above that integrates really smoothly into the design of the house. All of the doors are these sliding glass panels, so it's very easy to open up to the exterior. And the interior and exterior spaces follow similar designs in terms of orientation. And so the space on each level is equal, but some of the spaces have more exterior than interior space, if that makes sense. So you have the same volume of space in the design, but the exterior space is considered as important as the interior space. Okay. So the interior and exterior spaces also, they kind of like intermingle, and the windows and the way we have this balance of interior and exterior space, often with a lot of open space on the bottom layers of his buildings, it creates this feeling of lightness and buoyancy. Also, everything is rendered very smooth surfaces. There's not a bunch of decorative. He doesn't really believe in decorative work because that doesn't serve function, right? So he's not into that. Okay, so that's Le Corbusier and international style. Okay, next time we're going to talk about regionalism and the Harlem Renaissance.